The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Interstate 35, creating waves of heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water. Kenny Rogers gripped the steering wheel of his vintage 1978 Chevy pickup, a truck he'd bought decades ago and refused to replace despite his success, and felt the familiar vibration that meant trouble. At 74, Kenny had learned to read the signs his old truck gave him. The slight pull to the right, the way the engine hesitated just before shifting gears, the almost imperceptible change in the sound of the transmission. Today, those signs were screaming that he needed help, and soon. A green highway sign announced, "Millerville, next exit," and Kenny took it, hoping the small Texas town would have what he needed. The exit ramp led to a main street that looked like it had been frozen in time around 1975. A few local businesses lined the road. A diner with a neon sign that flickered coffee. A hardware store with seed packets displayed in the window. And there, like an answer to a prayer, Joe's Automotive Repair. The garage was a classic small-town operation. 2 service bays, an office with oil-stained calendars on the walls, and the kind of atmosphere that spoke of honest work and fair prices. A hand-painted sign by the entrance read, "42 years serving Millerville. Quality work, fair prices, your neighbor Joe." Kenny pulled into the parking area and shut off the engine, relieved when it actually started back up for the short drive into the garage bay. Through the open service doors, he could see a man in his 70s working under the hood of an older sedan, his movements careful but confident despite his age. "Help you?" called a voice from the office. A younger man, probably in his 40s, emerged wiping his hands on a rag. His uniform shirt had Mike embroidered above the pocket, and his expression carried the slightly weary look of someone who'd been dealing with difficult customers all day. "Engine's been acting up," Kenny said, climbing out of the truck. "Sounds like transmission trouble. Maybe something with the cooling system too." Mike nodded and walked around the truck, his trained eye taking in details that most people would miss. "Nice truck. They don't make them like this anymore. Let me get Joe to take a look. He's got more experience with these older Chevys than anyone in 3 counties." The older man Kenny had seen working emerged from under the hood of the sedan, wiping his hands on a shop rag that had seen countless years of service. Joe Thompson was probably 73 or 74, with silver hair, weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work, and eyes that held the quiet confidence of a man who'd solved thousands of mechanical problems. "What seems to be the trouble?" Joe asked, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd been diagnosing car problems since before Kenny had his first hit record. "Started this morning," Kenny explained. "Transmission's slipping a little, and I think the radiator might have a slow leak. Nothing dramatic, but I've got a long drive ahead of me." Joe nodded and popped the hood, immediately beginning the systematic inspection that separated experienced mechanics from amateurs. He checked fluid levels, listened to the engine, and ran his hands along hoses and belts with the practiced touch of a physician examining a patient. "Well," Joe said after a few minutes, "the good news is it's nothing catastrophic. Bad news is you're going to be here for a few hours. Transmission needs fluid and a filter, radiator's got a small leak that I can patch, and your belts should be replaced before they leave you stranded somewhere." Kenny felt relief wash over him. "How long do you think?" "If we get started now, maybe 3 hours. Got to order one part, but my supplier can have it here in an hour." "That's fine. I'm not in any particular hurry." Joe smiled. "That's refreshing. Most folks these days act like waiting for proper repairs is some kind of personal insult." As if summoned by those words, a black BMW pulled into the parking area with the aggressive urgency of someone who believed their time was more valuable than everyone else's. The car's engine revved unnecessarily before shutting off, and the driver's door opened to reveal a man in an expensive suit who surveyed the modest garage with obvious disdain. Kenneth Bradley was probably in his 50s, with the kind of artificial tan and perfectly styled hair that spoke of wealth and self-importance. His watch probably cost more than most people's cars, and his entire demeanor radiated the entitlement of someone who'd never been told no in any meaningful way. "Are you the mechanic?" Bradley demanded, not bothering with pleasantries as he approached Joe. "I am," Joe replied calmly. "What can I do for you?" "My car's making a noise. I need it fixed immediately. I have a very important meeting in Dallas in 2 hours." Joe walked over to the BMW and popped the hood. The engine was still ticking as it cooled, and he listened carefully for several moments before straightening up. "Sounds like your water pump's going bad," Joe said. "It's not an emergency yet, but you should get it fixed soon, probably within the next week or 2. Bradley's face reddened. I don't want to know when I should fix it. I want it fixed right now. Sir, even if I had the part in stock, which I don't, a water pump replacement takes about 4 hours of work. It's not something you do in a quick hurry. Then what good are you? Bradley snapped. This is supposed to be a repair shop, isn't it? Kenny watched this exchange with growing unease. He'd encountered his share of difficult people over the years. But there was something particularly ugly about watching someone abuse their position of perceived power over a working man. The humiliation Joe Thompson had dealt with impatient customers for over 4 decades. But something about Kenneth Bradley's tone set his teeth on edge. Still, professionalism had been beaten into him by years of depending on customer satisfaction for his livelihood. Sir, I understand you're in a hurry, but some repairs can't be rushed. If you'd like, I can recommend a BMW dealership in Dallas that might be able to help you faster. I don't want recommendations, Bradley interrupted. I want competence. How long have you been working on cars? 42 years, Joe replied, his voice still patient but with a slight edge creeping in. 42 years and you can't figure out how to fix a simple water pump in less than 4 hours? Maybe it's time you retired and let someone competent take over. Mike stepped forward from where he'd been watching. Sir, my father knows more about car repair than anyone in this county. He's not exaggerating about the time it takes to… I wasn't talking to you, Bradley snapped. And frankly, if this is a family operation, that explains the incompetence. Nepotism instead of actual skill. Kenny felt his jaw clench. Mike was Joe's son, working alongside his father in the business that had supported their family for decades. The casual cruelty of Bradley's words struck him as particularly vicious. Joe's face had gone very still, the way it does when someone is working hard to control their temper. Mr. Bradley. Kenneth Bradley of Bradley Development Corporation. I own half the commercial real estate in this county. Well, Mr. Bradley, I've given you my professional assessment. Your water pump is failing. It takes 4 hours to replace properly, and I don't have the part in stock. Those are facts, not opinions. Facts? Bradley laughed, but there was no humor in it. The fact is, I'm looking at a rundown garage run by an old man who probably can't see well enough to diagnose his own problems, let alone mine. The shop fell silent except for the distant hum of an air compressor. Mike's face had gone white with anger, and even Kenny could feel the tension radiating from the younger man. But it was Joe's reaction that broke Kenny's heart. The older man's shoulders sagged slightly, and something flickered across his face. Not anger, but hurt. The kind of deep hurt that comes from having your life's work dismissed and your competence questioned based on nothing but age and appearances. Dad knows more about engines than most factory-trained technicians, Mike said quietly, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. He's been fixing cars since before you could drive. Is that supposed to impress me? Bradley shot back. 40 years of working with his hands in some backwoods garage. I run a multi-million-dollar corporation. I think I know something about competence and efficiency. Joe straightened slowly, his dignity reasserting itself despite the verbal assault. Mr. Bradley, I'm sorry I can't help you on your timeline. If you'd like to take your car elsewhere, I understand completely. Oh, I'll be taking it elsewhere, all right. And I'll be making sure everyone knows about the level of service I received here. This county has no place for businesses that can't keep up with modern demands. Bradley turned toward his car, then paused and looked back at Joe with a cruel smile. Maybe it's time you faced reality, old man. The world has passed you by. Find yourself a nice rocking chair and let actual professionals handle the work. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Kenny watched Joe's face and saw something die behind his eyes. The quiet pride that had sustained him through decades of honest work. The confidence that came from knowing his value as a craftsman. Mike took a step toward Bradley, his fists clenched, but Joe caught his arm. Let it go, son, Joe said quietly. He's not worth it. Kenny Rogers had remained silent through this entire exchange, partly out of respect for Joe's right to handle his own customer, partly because he was so stunned by the casual cruelty he was witnessing. But as Bradley climbed back into his BMW and prepared to leave, something inside Kenny snapped. The same instinct that had driven him to help struggling artists over the years, the same values his parents had instilled in him about treating people with respect regardless of their station in life, rose up like a tide. As Bradley's engine started, Kenny stepped forward. Excuse me, Mr. Bradley. The intervention. Kenneth Bradley paused with his hand on the gear shift, his expression showing irritation at being delayed further. Through his open window, he looked at Kenny with the dismissive glance he might give to any other small-town local. Yes? What is it now? Kenny walked closer to the BMW, his manner calm but purposeful. At 74, he had long since learned that quiet confidence often carried more weight than loud bluster. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Joe there. I wanted to ask you something. Make it quick. I'm already late for my meeting. Well, I was wondering, what kind of car is this? Bradley looked puzzled by the question. It's a BMW 7 Series. Why? Beautiful car. Probably cost around $80,000 new? Closer to 90. Again, what's your point? Kenny nodded appreciatively. That's a lot of money. The kind of investment a man makes when he wants the very best, when he refuses to settle for anything less than excellence. Obviously. So when this expensive, precision-engineered machine starts making unusual noises, you bring it to the first place you can find, demand an instant diagnosis, and then question the competence of the man giving you free advice. Bradley's eyes narrowed. I don't see how this is any of your business. You made it my business when you decided to humiliate a good man in front of his son and a customer. See, I've been standing here for the last 15 minutes, and I've learned a few things. Kenny gestured toward the garage. I've learned that Joe Thompson has been fixing cars in this town for 42 years, which means he started when cars were a lot simpler and has adapted to every technological change the industry has thrown at him. I've learned that his son works alongside him, which suggests this is a family business built on reputation and trust. And I've learned that they both treated you with respect even when you didn't deserve it. Who the hell do you think you are to lecture me about? I'm someone who recognizes quality when I see it, Kenny interrupted gently. And I see a lot more quality in that garage than I do sitting in this car right now. Bradley's face was reddening. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Actually, I think I do. You're someone who mistakes money for character, who thinks success gives you the right to treat working people like servants. You're someone who's never had to depend on the skill and integrity of craftsmen like Joe Thompson. Kenny leaned slightly closer to the car window. Let me tell you what I know about your water pump problem. Joe diagnosed it in about 30 seconds, gave you an honest timeline for repair, and tried to help you find alternatives. That's exactly what a competent, experienced mechanic should do. And you're an expert on car repair? I'm an expert on people. And the people in that garage have something you can't buy with all your development corporation money: integrity. Bradley revved his engine. I don't have to listen to this garbage from some local yokel. No, you don't, Kenny agreed. You can drive away right now, take your car to Dallas, and let them charge you double what Joe would charge for the same work. But before you do, I want you to understand something. Kenny's voice grew quieter, more serious. That man you just humiliated has probably forgotten more about automotive repair than most certified technicians will ever learn. He's been keeping the people of this community mobile for 4 decades, and he's done it with honesty and fair prices. What have you contributed to this community besides arrogance? I employ hundreds of people. Do you treat them the way you just treated Joe? The question hung in the air. Bradley's jaw worked as he struggled for a response. Because if you do, Kenny continued, then you're not an employer. You're a bully with a business license. And bullies always get what's coming to them eventually. Mike had emerged from the garage and was standing near his father, both men watching this confrontation with expressions of amazement. Other people had begun to gather, the waitress from the diner next door, a couple of customers from the hardware store drawn by the raised voices and unusual scene. You don't know anything about me or my business, Bradley said. But some of the bluster had gone out of his voice. I know enough. I know you're the kind of man who thinks being rich gives you the right to be cruel. I know you're the kind of person who tears others down instead of building them up. And I know that in about 5 minutes, you're going to drive away and forget all about this, while Joe Thompson goes home tonight wondering if maybe you were right about him being too old for this work. Kenny straightened up. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to Joe and his son for your behavior. You're going to acknowledge that Joe gave you good advice and professional service. And then you're going to drive to Dallas and get your water pump fixed, hopefully with a better understanding of how to treat working people. Bradley stared at Kenny for a long moment. And if I don't? Then you'll drive away knowing that everyone who witnessed this will remember you as the rich man who got put in his place by someone who understood the value of human dignity. The small crowd that had gathered was listening intently now. In a town like Millerville, stories like this would be told and retold, becoming part of local folklore. Bradley seemed to recognize this, and Kenny could see him calculating the potential damage to his reputation. "This is ridiculous," Bradley muttered, but he shut off his engine. The apology. Kenneth Bradley sat in his car for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The small crowd that had gathered maintained a respectful distance, but their presence was unmistakable. In a town like Millerville, this confrontation would be the subject of conversation for weeks to come. Finally, Bradley opened his car door and stepped out. His expensive suit and polished shoes seemed almost comical against the backdrop of the working-class garage, like a peacock in a chicken coop. He walked toward Joe Thompson with the stiff gait of a man doing something he'd never done before, backing down from a position of power. "Mr. Thompson," Bradley began, his voice lacking its earlier arrogance. Joe looked at him warily. "Yes? I owe you an apology. My behavior was inappropriate. You gave me professional advice and I responded poorly." The words came out stilted, like a child reciting a forced apology, but they were words nonetheless. Joe nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, Mr. Bradley." "And you, young man?" Bradley turned to Mike. "I'm sorry for questioning your father's competence. It was out of line." Mike simply nodded, his arms crossed over his chest. Kenny watched this exchange with mixed feelings. The apology was clearly forced, lacking any genuine remorse, but it was still an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Sometimes that was the best you could hope for from someone who had never learned the value of humility. "Thank you," Joe said simply. "If you change your mind about the water pump, we'll be here." Bradley nodded curtly and returned to his car. As he prepared to leave, he rolled down his window and looked at Kenny. "I still don't know who you are, but you made your point." "My name's Kenny Rogers," Kenny said quietly. "And my point was that how we treat people says everything about who we are." Bradley's eyes widened slightly at the name, and Kenny could see recognition dawning. "The singer?" "Among other things." For a moment, Bradley looked like he might say something else, but then he simply nodded and drove away, his BMW disappearing down the main street of Millerville. The small crowd began to disperse, people returning to their daily routines but carrying with them a story they would tell for years to come. The waitress from the diner approached Kenny with a smile. "That was something else," she said. "Joe's good people. Glad someone stood up for him." "He didn't need me to stand up for him," Kenny replied. "He was handling it just fine with dignity and professionalism. I just couldn't stand to watch someone try to tear down a good man." After the excitement died down, Kenny found himself alone with Joe and Mike in the garage. The father and son seemed uncertain how to process what had just happened. "Mr. Rogers," Joe said finally, "I want to thank you for what you did. But you didn't have to get involved." "Yes, I did," Kenny said simply. "Where I come from, you don't let good people get abused without speaking up." Mike shook his head in amazement. "I can't believe Kenny Rogers just defended my dad from some rich jerk. This is the best story I'm going to tell for the rest of my life." Kenny laughed. "Well, make sure you tell it right. Your father's the hero of this story, not me. He's the one who's been serving this community with integrity for 4 decades. Joe looked down at his oil-stained hands. "Some days it feels like that doesn't matter much anymore. Everything's changing so fast. People want things fixed instantly, cheaply, and they don't understand that quality work takes time." "Quality always matters," Kenny said firmly. "It might not always be appreciated in the moment, but it endures. That's what separates craftsmen from parts changers." "You sound like you know something about that." Kenny smiled. "I've been making music for 50 years. I've learned that there's no substitute for taking the time to do things right, whether you're recording a song or rebuilding a transmission." Joe nodded thoughtfully. "Music and mechanics aren't that different, I suppose. Both require patience, skill, and attention to detail." "And both require passion," Kenny added. "You can't fake caring about your work. People can always tell the difference." Mike had been listening to this conversation with growing interest. "Mr. Rogers, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really step in back there? I mean, you could have just waited in the office, let Dad handle it his own way." Kenny considered the question carefully. "Because I've been fortunate in my life. I've had success, recognition, opportunities that not everyone gets. With that fortune comes a responsibility to use it for good when you can." He gestured around the garage. Your father represents something important. Honest work, fair dealing, expertise earned through decades of experience. When someone tries to tear that down for no reason other than their own ego, it diminishes all of us. But you've never met us before today. Doesn't matter. Good people are good people wherever you find them. And when good people are under attack, other good people have a duty to help. Joe wiped his hands on his rag, a gesture Kenny was beginning to recognize as a habit when the older man was thinking. Mr. Rogers, can I tell you something? Sure. When that man was saying those things about me being too old, about not being competent, for a minute there I almost believed him. Kenny felt his heart clench. Joe, I'm 73 years old. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be. My back aches after a long day, and sometimes I have to look things up that I used to know by heart. When someone like Bradley comes in here talking about efficiency and modern demands, it makes me wonder if maybe I am holding things back. Let me ask you something, Kenny said. How many satisfied customers have you had over the years? Joe thought about it. Thousands, I suppose. How many of them came back to you when they needed work done again? Most of them. How many times have you diagnosed a problem that other mechanics missed, or fixed something that someone else said couldn't be repaired? Joe's expression began to brighten. More times than I can count. Then you have your answer. Experience isn't a liability, Joe. It's an asset that can't be bought or taught in school. What you have is irreplaceable. Mike stepped closer to his father. Dad, you remember Mrs. Henderson's old Buick? The one that 3 other shops said was ready for the junkyard? Joe smiled. That was a good puzzle. Took me 2 days to figure out what was really wrong with it. And it's still running 5 years later, Mike added, looking at Kenny. That's the difference between someone who's been doing this for 40 years and someone who just follows a diagnostic manual. Kenny nodded. That's exactly right. Age doesn't make you obsolete, Joe. It makes you seasoned. There's a difference. The story behind the hands. As Joe began working on Kenny's truck, a comfortable rhythm settled over the garage. The older mechanic moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times, while Mike assisted with the efficiency that comes from years of working alongside a master craftsman. Kenny found himself fascinated by the process. There was something almost musical about the way Joe worked. The careful diagnosis, the methodical disassembly, the gentle coaxing of stubborn parts. It reminded him of his own approach to songwriting, the way he would work through a melody until every note felt exactly right. You make it look easy, Kenny observed, as Joe carefully removed the transmission pan. 42 years of practice, Joe replied, examining the old filter he'd just removed. Though every car teaches you something new, that's what keeps it interesting. How did you get started in this business? Joe paused in his work, a distant look crossing his face. Now that's a story. My father was a sharecropper, and we were poor as church mice. When I was 16, I got a job at a gas station in town. This was back when gas stations actually fixed cars, not just sold fuel. He carefully positioned the new filter. The owner, Mr. Wilson, took a liking to me. Said I had good hands and a patient temperament. He started teaching me everything he knew, not just how to change oil and fix flat tires, but real mechanical work. Sounds like a good man. The best. When he retired in 1962, he sold me the business for what I could afford, which wasn't much. Said he'd rather see it go to someone who cared about the work than someone who just wanted to make money. Kenny smiled. I bet you've never regretted that decision. Not once. Oh, there have been hard times. Recessions when people held onto their cars longer. Competition from chain stores. All the usual challenges of running a small business. But I've never regretted choosing this life. Mike looked up from where he was preparing the new radiator hose. Tell him about the vintage cars, Dad. Joe's face lit up. Well, that's my real passion. Modern cars are fine, but the classics, that's where the art is. Cars from the 50s and 60s, when everything was mechanical and you could actually see what you were working on. You restore them? As a hobby, mostly. Though word's gotten around and I get calls from collectors all over Texas. Last year I rebuilt a 1967 Mustang Fastback for a collector in Houston. Took me 8 months, but when I was done, it was better than the day it rolled off the assembly line. Kenny could hear the pride in Joe's voice, the same kind of satisfaction he felt when a song came together perfectly. That must be incredibly rewarding work. It is. When you take something that's broken down, neglected, maybe even written off as worthless, and you bring it back to life, there's no feeling quite like it. Sounds familiar, Kenny said. I've worked with a few artists over the years who thought their careers were over, who had been written off by the industry. Sometimes all it takes is someone who believes in them and is willing to do the careful work of restoration. Joe nodded thoughtfully. I imagine music and mechanics have more in common than most people think. As the morning progressed, Kenny learned more about Joe's life. He'd been married to the same woman, Margaret, for 48 years. They'd raised 3 children, Mike, who worked with him now, a daughter who was a nurse in Dallas, and another son who taught high school mathematics. Margaret keeps telling me I should retire, Joe said as he worked on the radiator repair. Says I've earned the right to take it easy. What do you tell her? That I'm not ready. This work is part of who I am. I'm not sure I'd know how to be Joe Thompson without grease under my fingernails and the sound of engines in my ears. Kenny understood that feeling completely. How many times had people suggested he should retire, enjoy his success, stop touring and recording? But music wasn't just what he did. It was who he was. Besides, Joe continued, Mike's not ready to take over completely. He's good, very good, but there's still so much I want to teach him. The old tricks, the subtle things you learn over decades of working with your hands. Mike looked up from his work. Dad, I've been working here for 15 years. I think I know the business pretty well. You know the business, son, but you don't know the craft. Not completely. There's a difference between being able to fix a car and being able to fix it right. Kenny heard something in Joe's voice, not criticism of his son, but a deep concern about passing on something precious. It reminded him of his own relationship with young artists, the desire to share not just technical knowledge but wisdom accumulated over a lifetime. What's the most important thing you've learned in 42 years? Kenny asked. Joe stopped working and considered the question seriously. That every car has a story. Every dent, every worn part, every strange noise. It all tells you something about the people who drove it, how they lived their lives, what they valued. He gestured toward Kenny's truck. Take your Chevy here. This truck's been loved. I can tell by the way it's been maintained, the quality of parts that were used in previous repairs, the care someone took to keep the original character intact. This truck means something to someone. It was my father's, Kenny said quietly. He bought it new in 1978, drove it until the day he died. I inherited it, and I've never had the heart to replace it. Joe nodded. I knew it was something like that. Cars like this, they carry memories. That's why I could never sell this place to some chain operation. They'd see inventory and profit margins. I see stories. As if to punctuate his point, an elderly woman pulled up in a pristine 1985 Cadillac DeVille. Joe wiped his hands and walked out to greet her. Morning, Mrs. Patterson. How's the caddy treating you? Oh, Joe, she's running like a dream. I just wanted to thank you again for the work you did last month. My late husband would be so pleased to know his car is in such good hands. Kenny watched this interaction and saw something beautiful. The connection between a craftsman and someone who appreciated his work, the continuation of relationships built over decades of trust and quality service. This was what Kenneth Bradley had failed to understand. Joe Thompson wasn't just a mechanic. He was a guardian of memories, a keeper of stories, a link between the past and the present. The revelation. As Joe finished the final adjustments on Kenny's truck, testing the transmission and checking all the fluid levels, the conversation turned to more personal matters. There was something about working alongside a master craftsman that invited deeper conversation, the way shared purpose often opened doors to genuine connection. Mr. Rogers, Joe said as he cleaned his tools, can I ask you something that's been on my mind? Of course. That man earlier, Bradley, he said some things that got under my skin. Not the insults exactly, but his attitude about this kind of work. Like fixing cars was somehow beneath him, like working with your hands wasn't real work. Kenny nodded. I noticed that too. What bothers you most about it? Joe was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. My whole life I've believed that honest work had dignity. That if you did your job well, treated people fairly, and took pride in your craft, that meant something. But lately, it feels like the world doesn't see it that way anymore. What do you mean? Everything's about speed now, convenience, getting the cheapest price. People want their cars fixed like they want their food, fast and cheap. They don't want to pay for experience or craftsmanship, they just want it done. Mike looked up from where he was putting away tools. Dad gets discouraged when customers act like we're just parts changers instead of actual mechanics. It's not that I mind the hard work, Joe continued. I've never minded that. But when someone like Bradley looks at me and sees nothing but an old man who's outlived his usefulness, it makes me wonder if everything I've built here matters. Kenny felt a deep sadness hearing this. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to honest labor, who had supported his family and served his community for over 4 decades, questioning his own worth because of the thoughtless cruelty of someone who equated net worth with human value. Joe, can I tell you about something that happened to me early in my career? Sure. I was performing at a club in Houston, probably around 1968. I was nobody then, just another guy with a guitar trying to make it in the music business. After my set, this well-dressed businessman came up to me and said, "Son, you've got a nice voice, but you'll never amount to anything playing that hillbilly music. Why don't you get a real job?" Joe smiled. I take it he was wrong. He was and he wasn't. He was wrong about my potential, but he was right about one thing. The music business wasn't going to be easy. There would be plenty of people who didn't understand what I was trying to do, who thought country music was beneath them. Kenny leaned against the workbench. But you know what I learned? The opinion of someone who doesn't understand your craft doesn't diminish the value of that craft. That businessman couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, but he felt qualified to judge my music. Bradley couldn't diagnose a car problem if his life depended on it, but he felt qualified to judge your competence. So what did you do when people dismissed your music? I kept playing, I kept writing songs. I kept believing that what I was doing mattered, even when other people didn't see it. And eventually, enough people did see it that the critics didn't matter anymore. Joe nodded slowly. But music is different. You became famous. People recognize the value of what you do now. Fame doesn't create value, Joe. It just makes value more visible. Your work had value 40 years ago. It has value today, and it'll have value tomorrow, regardless of whether people like Bradley recognize it. Mike stepped closer to his father. Dad, remember what happened 3 months ago with the Jenkins family? Joe's expression softened. What about them? Tell Mr. Rogers what you did for them. Joe looked embarrassed. It wasn't anything special. Tell him anyway. Joe sighed. The Jenkins family, they're going through a rough patch. The husband lost his job, they've got 3 kids, and their car broke down. It needed about $800 worth of work, money they didn't have. So what did you do? Kenny asked. I fixed it anyway, told them they could pay me when things got better. And? They've been making small payments when they can. $20 here, $30 there. It's not about the money. Kenny smiled. So let me get this straight. You provided essential service to a family in crisis, trusted them to pay you back when they could, and kept their only transportation running so the husband could look for work and the kids could get to school. Well, yes, but Joe, that's not just mechanical work. That's ministry. That's using your skills to make a real difference in people's lives. Mike beamed with pride. Dad does stuff like that all the time. Mrs. Wilson's Social Security check doesn't cover much, so Dad always finds a way to fix her car for whatever she can afford. The Martinez family's van needed major work last year, and Dad let them work off the debt by having their teenage son help around the shop. Kenny felt a warmth spreading through his chest. Joe, do you realize what you've just described? You've described a man who uses his skills not just to make a living, but to strengthen his community. That's the definition of meaningful work. I never thought of it that way. Well, you should, because that's exactly what it is. Kenny gestured around the garage. This place isn't just an automotive repair shop. It's a cornerstone of this community. People depend on you not just for car repairs, but for honesty, reliability, and compassion. Joe looked down at his hands. These weathered tools that had supported his family and served his neighbors for decades. Sometimes I forget that. Then let me remind you of something else, Kenny said. When I was starting out in music, I had to work other jobs to pay the bills. I worked construction, I sold appliances, I did whatever it took to survive while I chased my dreams. But those jobs taught me something important about the dignity of work. What's that? Every honest job has honor. The man who builds houses, the woman who serves food, the mechanic who keeps cars running. They're all essential to the fabric of society. Without people like you, civilization would grind to a halt. Mike nodded emphatically. That's what I've been trying to tell him. Dad, you're not just a mechanic. You're an artist, a problem solver, a community leader. Your son's right, Kenny agreed. What you do requires creativity, intuition, experience, and skill. That's artistry, pure and simple. As if to prove the point, a young woman pulled up in an older Honda that was making an alarming grinding noise. Joe immediately perked up, his professional instincts engaging. "Excuse me for a minute," he said, walking out to meet the customer. Kenny and Mike watched through the bay door as Joe listened to the car, asked a few questions, and then popped the hood. Within minutes, he had diagnosed the problem and was explaining it to the worried-looking woman. "Brake pads," Mike said quietly. "I can tell by the way Dad's pointing at the wheels. Probably caught it just in time before it became dangerous." "How can you tell?" "I've watched him do this thousands of times. He has a way of moving, a way of listening, that tells you everything about what he's thinking." They watched as Joe's explanation seemed to calm the woman's anxiety. His manner was patient, reassuring, educational rather than condescending. When she nodded and agreed to the repair, relief was visible on her face. "That's another thing Dad does," Mike said. "He explains things in a way that people can understand, without making them feel stupid for not knowing about cars." Joe returned to the bay, already mentally planning the brake job. "Sorry about that. Sarah Morrison, her brakes were about 2 days away from complete failure. Good thing she brought it in when she did." "You probably just prevented an accident," Kenny observed. "Maybe. That's the thing about this work. Sometimes you're not just fixing cars, you're protecting lives." Kenny felt his understanding of Joe's work deepening. This wasn't just about mechanical aptitude or customer service. This was about responsibility, about being trusted with people's safety and mobility. "Joe, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "What do you want your legacy to be? When people in this town remember Joe Thompson, what do you want them to remember?" Joe was quiet for a long moment, wiping his hands with the unconscious gesture Kenny had noticed all morning. "I want them to remember that when they needed help, I was here. That when their car broke down, or they couldn't afford a repair, or they just needed someone to explain what was wrong in plain English, I was someone they could count on. That's a beautiful legacy. And I want Mike to be able to carry that forward. Not exactly the same way. He'll have his own style, his own approach, but with the same values. Honesty, quality, compassion." Kenny looked at Mike, who was listening to his father with obvious love and respect. "It looks like you're succeeding at that." "I hope so. That's why moments like what happened with Bradley bother me so much. I worry that the values I've tried to build this business on don't matter anymore." "They matter more than ever," Kenny said firmly. "In a world that's becoming increasingly impersonal and automated, the human touch becomes more valuable, not less. People still need to trust someone with their problems. They still need to feel like they're being treated fairly." "You really believe that?" "I know it. In my business, I've seen trends come and go. I've seen technology change everything about how music is made and distributed. But one thing never changes: people's need for authentic connection. That's what you provide here. The unexpected connection." As the afternoon wore on, Kenny found himself reluctant to leave the garage. There was something deeply satisfying about the rhythm of the work, the problem-solving, the craftsmanship. But more than that, he was drawn to Joe's story, sensing there were layers he hadn't yet discovered. "Joe," Kenny said as the older mechanic put the finishing touches on the brake job for Sarah Morrison, "you mentioned that you've been doing this for 42 years. That means you started in 1981. "That's right. Took over from Mr. Wilson in March of '81. That was a tough time for a lot of businesses. Recession, high interest rates, people holding on to their money." Joe nodded grimly. "Almost lost everything in the first 2 years. People were keeping their cars longer, putting off repairs, shopping around for the cheapest prices. There were nights I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake." "What kept you going?" "Margaret, mostly. And the belief that if I just kept doing good work, treating people fairly, eventually things would turn around." Mike looked up from organizing tools. Dad never talks about how close we came to losing the shop. Mike was just a baby then, Joe explained. Margaret was working at the school district to help make ends meet, and I was working 16-hour days just to stay afloat. There were weeks when I didn't take a salary so I could pay my parts suppliers. Kenny felt a deep respect for this man's perseverance. But you made it through. Barely. And I learned something important. Success isn't just about making money. It's about building relationships, earning trust, becoming indispensable to your community. How do you mean? Joe gestured toward the office where certificates and photos lined the walls. See those pictures? That's 40 years of customers who became friends. Mrs. Patterson, who's been bringing her cars here since 1983. The Rodriguez family, who've trusted me with everything from their first pickup truck to their daughter's graduation car. 3 generations of the Williams family. Kenny walked over to examine the photos more closely. They showed Joe at various ages, always smiling, always surrounded by satisfied customers and their vehicles. It was a visual record of a life spent in service to others. This is beautiful, Joe. It's like a family album. In a way, it is. These people aren't just customers. They're my community. When old Mrs. Henderson was in the hospital, her neighbors brought her car here to make sure it would be ready when she got out. When the Martinez family's son graduated from college, they brought the whole family by to share the news. Kenny felt something stirring in his memory. Joe, you said you took over this place in 1981. That's right. And before that, you worked for Mr. Wilson. For 15 years, yeah. Started when I was 18. Learned everything from him. What was Mr. Wilson's first name? Joe looked puzzled by the question. Robert. Robert Wilson. Why? Kenny felt his heart skip a beat. Did he ever mention knowing anyone in the music business? Maybe someone who used to stop by when they were traveling through Texas. Well, funny you should ask. He used to tell stories about a young musician who'd stop by every few months in the late 60s and early 70s. Said the kid was always respectful, always paid his bills, and had dreams of making it big in Nashville. Kenny's mouth went dry. Do you remember what kind of car this musician drove? Joe thought for a moment. Mr. Wilson always said it was a beat-up old Ford Galaxy, white with a dent in the rear quarter panel. Said that car was held together with prayers and determination. And this musician, did Mr. Wilson ever mention his name? He did, actually. Said the kid's name was Kenny something. Kenny... Joe's eyes suddenly widened. Kenny Rogers. The garage fell silent. Mike stopped working and stared at his father, then at Kenny. You? Joe whispered. You're that Kenny Rogers. The one Mr. Wilson used to talk about? Kenny nodded, feeling a strange sense of destiny settling over the moment. I drove through Millerville dozens of times between 1968 and 1972. There was a gas station here run by a man named Robert Wilson. He was always kind to me, never made me feel like I was just another broke musician. Joe sat down heavily on a work stool. I can't believe this. Mr. Wilson used to tell me about you all the time. He'd say, Joe, mark my words, that boy's going to be somebody someday. He's got something special. He believed in me when I had no reason to believe in myself, Kenny said softly. I was driving this same truck, well, my father's truck, trying to make it to gigs, usually with about $10 in my pocket. Mr. Wilson never charged me full price for gas, and he fixed my car more than once when I couldn't afford to pay immediately. He never forgot you, Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. Even years later, when you became famous, he'd point to the radio when one of your songs came on and say, "That's my boy Kenny. I knew he'd make it." Mike shook his head in amazement. This is unbelievable. Dad, you've been telling Mr. Wilson stories about Kenny Rogers my whole life. And now? And now Kenny Rogers is here, in our garage, just like the old days, Joe finished. Kenny felt tears prickling his eyes. Joe, I need you to know something. Your Mr. Wilson was more than just a kind gas station owner to me. He was proof that good people existed in the world. When I was discouraged, when I thought about giving up, I'd remember his kindness and it would give me strength to keep going. He'd be so proud to know that. I always meant to come back and thank him properly once I had the success to show for it. But life got busy, tours and recording and all the demands of the music business. By the time I tried to find him, he passed in 1995, Joe said gently. Heart attack, went peacefully in his sleep. Kenny nodded, feeling the familiar regret of gratitude unexpressed. I'm sorry I never got to tell him what his kindness meant to me. You just did, Joe said simply. You told me, and I'll carry that story forward. That's how these things work. Kindness echoes through time, even when we don't realize it. Kenny looked around the garage with new eyes. This wasn't just where his truck was being repaired. This was a sacred place, a continuation of the legacy of kindness that Robert Wilson had started decades ago. The circle of kindness. The revelation that Kenny had been one of Robert Wilson's boys transformed the atmosphere in the garage completely. What had begun as a routine repair job had become something approaching a reunion, a closing of a circle that had been open for more than 50 years. Mr. Wilson used to say you were special, Joe said, still struggling to process the connection. He'd tell me, Joe, I've met a lot of people in this business, but that Kenny Rogers boy has something different. He's got talent, but more than that, he's got character. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, Kenny replied. I was just a kid with a guitar, trying to make ends meet. But Mr. Wilson treated me like I mattered, like my dreams were worth supporting. Mike had stopped pretending to work and was listening intently. Dad, tell him about the wall. What wall? Kenny asked. Joe looked embarrassed. It's nothing, really. Dad, Mike insisted. Show him. Reluctantly, Joe led Kenny to a corner of the office that wasn't visible from the main work area. There, in a simple frame, was a collection of newspaper clippings, magazine articles, and photographs chronicling Kenny Rogers' career over the decades. Mr. Wilson started this, Joe explained. Every time you had a hit song, every time you won an award, every time there was an article about you in the paper, he'd clip it out and add it to the collection. He called it his Proof That Dreams Come True wall. Kenny stared at the display, overwhelmed by the evidence of this stranger's faith in him. Headlines about The Gambler, reviews of concerts, photos from award shows. It was his entire career, carefully preserved by a man who had believed in him from the beginning. When Mr. Wilson died, his daughter was going to throw all this away, Joe continued. She didn't understand why her father had saved clippings about some country singer. I asked if I could have it instead. Why? Because Mr. Wilson's stories about you taught me something important about this business. He showed me that being a mechanic isn't just about fixing cars, it's about helping people pursue their dreams. Every time someone's car breaks down, you're either helping them get back on the road to their goals, or you're another obstacle in their path. Kenny felt his throat tighten. I had no idea anyone was paying that much attention. Mr. Wilson paid attention to everyone who came through here. But he had a special interest in people who were struggling to make something of themselves. Musicians, traveling salesmen, young families moving to new towns. He saw himself as part of their journey. And you've continued that tradition. Joe nodded. I try to. It's not always easy. Some people are in such a hurry, they don't want personal connection. But when I can, I try to remember that I might be the only friendly face someone encounters on a difficult day. Kenny thought about all the gas stations, repair shops, and roadside cafes he'd visited over the years. How many Robert Wilsons had he encountered without recognizing their kindness? How many people had quietly supported his dreams without his awareness? Joe, can I ask you something? Of course. When Kenneth Bradley was here earlier, attacking your competence and your age, what were you thinking? Joe considered the question. Honestly, I was thinking that maybe he was right. Maybe I am getting too old for this work. Maybe it's time to step aside and let younger, more efficient people take over. And now? Now I'm thinking about Mr. Wilson and about you and about all the people over the years who've trusted me with their problems. I'm thinking that experience and kindness might be worth more than efficiency and youth. Kenny smiled. They're worth everything, Joe. In a world that's becoming increasingly automated and impersonal, the human touch becomes more precious, not less. Mike stepped forward. Mr. Rogers, can I tell you something my dad probably won't tell you himself? Sure. Dad's been talking about retiring for the past 2 years. Mom wants him to sell the shop and take it easy. But I think what happened today, meeting you, hearing about Mr. Wilson's belief in dreams, I think it's reminded him why this work matters. Joe looked at his son with surprise. Mike, I never said I was definitely retiring. But you've been thinking about it. I can tell. You've been discouraged by people like Bradley, by the way the business is changing, by feeling like what we do here doesn't matter anymore. Kenny watched this family conversation unfold, understanding that his presence had become a catalyst for something important. Sometimes an outside perspective was needed to help people see the value of their own lives. "Joe," Kenny said carefully, "what would happen to this community if you retired?" "Someone else would take over the shop. There's always someone willing to fix cars." "But would they continue Mr. Wilson's tradition? Would they care about their customers as people, not just sources of revenue? Would they help families in crisis or support people's dreams?" Joe was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know." "I do," Kenny said firmly. "Because I've seen what happens when businesses are run purely for profit instead of service. People become transactions, problems become inconveniences, and the human connections that make communities strong disappear." He gestured around the garage. "This place is more than an automotive repair shop, Joe. It's a sanctuary. It's where people come when they're vulnerable, when their transportation has failed and they need help. They don't just need mechanical expertise. They need to trust that they're being treated fairly, that someone cares about their problem. That's a lot of responsibility. It's the most important kind of responsibility, the responsibility we have to take care of each other." The decision. As the afternoon sun slanted through the garage bay doors, casting long shadows across the work floor, Kenny realized that his simple car repair had become something much more significant. The broken connection between past and present had been mended, and three men from different generations had found common ground in their understanding of what it meant to serve others. "Kenny," Joe said, using his first name for the first time, "I want to thank you for what you did earlier with Bradley. But more than that, I want to thank you for reminding me why this work matters." "You didn't need me to remind you, Joe. You already knew. Sometimes we just need someone else to reflect back to us what we already understand in our hearts." Joe walked over to the wall of photos showing decades of satisfied customers. "You know, when Mr. Wilson first hired me, I thought I was just learning to fix cars. I didn't realize he was teaching me how to be a pillar in the community." "What did he teach you that you remember most?" "He used to say, Joe, anyone can change oil or replace brake pads, but earning someone's trust, that's the real skill. When people trust you with their transportation, they're trusting you with their livelihood, their safety, their ability to care for their families. Don't ever take that lightly." Mike nodded. "Dad's told me that story 100 times. It's why he still personally talks to every customer, even for simple repairs." "And it's why I can't retire yet," Joe said with sudden clarity. "Not until I'm sure that tradition will continue." Kenny looked at Mike. "Are you planning to take over the business eventually?" "I've been hoping to, but Dad's been reluctant to commit to a timeline. I think he's been worried that I don't understand the deeper aspects of what we do here." Joe turned to his son with a new expression. "Mike, you've been working alongside me for 15 years. You know this business inside and out, but do you understand the responsibility?" "Dad, I've watched you help the Jenkins family, Mrs. Patterson, the Martinez family, and dozens of others. I've seen how you treat people, how you explain problems without making them feel stupid, how you sometimes work for less than you should because it's the right thing to do. If that's not understanding the responsibility, I don't know what is." Joe studied his son's face, seeing perhaps for the first time the mature man Mike had become. "You're right. I've been so focused on what I might be giving up that I haven't paid attention to what I'd be passing on." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying it's time to start the transition. Not tomorrow, but soon. I want to spend the next few years teaching you everything Mr. Wilson taught me about the business, and everything I've learned since then." Kenny felt a deep satisfaction watching this family moment unfold. "That sounds like wisdom to me." Joe smiled. "And I want to make sure we preserve what makes this place special. The personal service, the community connection, the willingness to go above and beyond for people who need help. Those values don't disappear automatically," Kenny observed. "They're passed down through example and teaching, just like mechanical skills." "Speaking of which," Joe said, returning to a more practical tone, "your truck is ready. New transmission filter and fluid, radiator leak repaired, belts replaced. She should run like new for another 100,000 miles." Kenny looked at his father's truck, now his truck, with the same appreciation he'd felt 40 years ago, when Mr. Wilson had kept it running on hope and determination. "What do I owe you?" Joe quoted a price that Kenny knew was below market rate. "Joe, that's not enough. This is quality work and I can afford to pay what it's worth." "Mr. Wilson never charged you full price," Joe said with a smile. "I'm just continuing the tradition." "Then let me contribute to another tradition," Kenny said, pulling out his checkbook. "I want to make a donation to help families like the Jenkins when their cars break down and they can't afford repairs." Joe's eyes widened as Kenny wrote a check for an amount that would fund dozens of charitable repairs. "Kenny, this is too much. It's not nearly enough. Consider it payment for 40 years of wondering what happened to the kind man who helped a struggling musician follow his dreams." Mike looked at the check and whistled softly. "Dad, with this we could help a lot of families." "We could set up a fund," Joe said thoughtfully. "The Robert Wilson Community Assistance Fund. Help people when their transportation breaks down and they can't afford to fix it." "I like that," Kenny said. Mr. Wilson's kindness continuing to ripple outward. As Kenny prepared to leave, Joe walked him to his truck. "Kenny, can I ask you something?" "Anything. Do you ever wonder how different your life might have been if Mr. Wilson hadn't been kind to you all those years ago?" Kenny considered the question. "I think about it sometimes. Maybe I would have given up on music sooner. Maybe I would have taken that factory job my father wanted me to take. Maybe I never would have made it to Nashville. But you did make it." "Yes, I did. And part of that was because people like Mr. Wilson showed me that the world contained kindness, that there were people who would help a stranger without expecting anything in return." Joe nodded. "That's what I want this place to represent. I want people to leave here feeling like the world is a little bit kinder than they thought it was." "Mission accomplished," Kenny said, shaking Joe's hand. "And Joe?" "Yeah?" "Mr. Wilson would be proud of you. You've honored his legacy beautifully." As Kenny climbed into his truck, Mike approached the window. "Mr. Rogers, thank you for standing up for my dad today. But more than that, thank you for helping him remember why he loves this work. Your father never forgot, Mike. He just needed someone to remind him that his work matters to people he'll never meet, in ways he'll never know." Kenny started the engine and it purred with the smooth confidence of a machine that had been repaired by expert hands. As he pulled out of the garage, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw Joe and Mike standing together, father and son, craftsmen and servants of their community. The ripple effect. 6 months later, Kenny received a letter postmarked from Millerville, Texas. Inside was a handwritten note from Joe Thompson, along with a newspaper clipping from the Millerville Weekly Herald. "Dear Kenny, I wanted to update you on what's been happening here since your visit. The Robert Wilson Community Assistance Fund has helped 43 families get their cars repaired when they couldn't afford it. Mike has taken over most of the daily operations, and I'm enjoying the role of senior consultant and community storyteller. But the biggest news is in the enclosed newspaper article. I thought you'd want to see it. Your friend always, Joe Thompson." Kenny unfolded the newspaper clipping and read the headline. "Local garage owner recognized for community service." The article described how Joe Thompson had been named Millerville Citizen of the Year for his decades of service to the community, his charitable work through the Assistance Fund, and his mentorship of young mechanics. But it was the quote from Joe in the article that brought tears to Kenny's eyes. "I learned a long time ago that being a mechanic isn't just about fixing cars. It's about helping people pursue their dreams. Whether someone's trying to get to work, take their child to the doctor, or chase their ambitions in a bigger city, reliable transportation is often the difference between success and failure. I'm honored to play a small part in people's journeys." The article went on to mention that Joe was planning to expand the garage, hiring 2 additional mechanics and establishing a formal apprenticeship program for young people interested in learning the trade the right way, with emphasis on both technical skill and community service. Kenny set the newspaper down and smiled. This was how change really happened, not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through the quiet accumulation of daily kindnesses, through people choosing to lift each other up instead of tear each other down. He thought about Kenneth Bradley and wondered if the confrontation at the garage had changed anything about the way he treated people. Probably not dramatically, but maybe it had planted a seed of awareness that would grow over time. A week later, Kenny decided to take a drive through Texas. It wasn't planned exactly. He told himself he was just restless, needing some time on the road to think about his next album. But somehow, his route took him through Millerville. Joe's automotive repair looked different. The building had been expanded, there were new service bays, and a professional sign announced the establishment of the Wilson Thompson Automotive Academy, teaching excellence in service and craft. Kenny pulled into the parking area and was greeted by Mike, who grinned broadly when he recognized the vintage Chevy. "Kenny, Dad's going to be so excited to see you." Joe emerged from one of the new service bays, his face lighting up with genuine joy. "Kenny Rogers, what brings you back to our little corner of Texas?" "Just passing through," Kenny said, though they all knew it wasn't entirely true. "Wanted to see how things were going." "Better than we ever imagined," Joe said, gesturing around the expanded facility. "We've got 6 full-time mechanics now, 3 apprentices, and a waiting list of young people who want to learn the trade." "And the community fund?" "We've helped over 100 families so far. Word's gotten out, and we're receiving donations from all over the county. People want to support the idea of helping their neighbors." Kenny toured the new facility, meeting the apprentices and hearing about the curriculum that combined technical training with lessons in customer service, business ethics, and community responsibility. "We call it the Mr. Wilson approach," one of the young apprentices explained. "It's not enough to be good with tools, you have to be good with people." As the afternoon wound down, Kenny found himself sitting with Joe in the office, surrounded by the photos and memories of 4 decades in business. "Any regrets about not retiring?" Kenny asked. Joe shook his head. "None. This expansion, this academy, this chance to pass on not just skills but values. It's the most fulfilling work I've ever done." "And Mike?" "Mike's everything I hoped he'd be and more. He's got his own ideas, his own way of doing things, but the foundation is solid. Mr. Wilson's legacy is in good hands." Kenny stood to leave as the sun began to set over Millerville. "Joe, I want you to know something. That day 6 months ago, when you thought Kenneth Bradley might be right about your being too old for this work." "Yeah?" "You proved that experience and kindness never become obsolete. You've built something here that will outlast all of us." As Kenny drove away from Millerville for what he somehow knew would be the last time, he reflected on the strange circularities of life. A kind gas station owner had helped a young musician decades ago. That musician had become successful enough to defend the gas station owner's successor against a bully, and that defense had inspired the creation of something larger and more lasting than any of them had imagined. Mr. Wilson's simple acts of kindness had rippled forward through time, touching lives he never knew about, creating connections he never could have foreseen. This was how the world really changed. One genuine interaction at a time, one choice to be kind instead of cruel, one decision to lift others up instead of tear them down. The legacy continues. 5 years after that transformative day when Kenneth Bradley learned about dignity and Kenny Rogers reconnected with his past, the Wilson Thompson Automotive Academy had become a model for vocational education throughout Texas. Young mechanics graduated not just with technical skills, but with a deep understanding of their role as community servants. Joe Thompson, now officially retired but still a daily presence at the garage, had become something of a local celebrity. He was frequently invited to speak at business groups and community organizations about the intersection of commerce and compassion. Mike Thompson had expanded the business to include a second location in a neighboring town, always with the same emphasis on quality work and community service. The Robert Wilson Community Assistance Fund had helped over 1,000 families and had inspired similar programs in dozens of other communities. Kenny Rogers, in his final years, often told the story of Joe Thompson and the garage that taught him about the continuing power of kindness. It became one of his favorite examples of how individual choices could create lasting change. And in Millerville, Texas, a simple plaque by the front door of Joe's Automotive Repair served as a daily reminder of the values that guided the business. In memory of Robert Wilson, 1925-1995, and in honor of all who choose kindness over convenience, service over profit, and community over self. Every day we have the chance to help someone pursue their dreams. Today, make that choice. The plaque was read daily by dozens of people, customers, employees, apprentices, and visitors. Each reading was a small reminder that how we treat each other matters, that dignity is not determined by wealth or status, and that the smallest acts of kindness can create the largest changes. Sometimes, late in the evening when the garage was closed and the town was quiet, Joe would sit on the bench outside his shop and think about the strange chain of events that had brought Kenny Rogers back into his life. A broken down truck, a rude customer, a moment of doubt, and a choice to stand up for what was right. It reminded him that we never know which moment will change everything, which conversation will redirect a life, which small kindness will grow into something transformational. All we can do is show up each day ready to be our best selves, treating others with respect and dignity regardless of their station in life. Because in the end, that's what really matters. Not what we accumulate, but what we contribute. Not how we're served, but how we serve. Not whether we're recognized, but whether we recognize the worth in others. The garage still hummed with activity each day, filled with the sounds of honest work and genuine care. And somewhere on the highways of America, other travelers were learning the same lesson that Kenny Rogers had learned decades earlier. That the world is full of Robert Wilsons and Joe Thompsons. People whose quiet kindness keeps the machinery of civilization running smoothly. You just have to be paying attention to notice them.